So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Senator Heidi Heitkamp was the senator from North Dakota from 2013 to 2019. She was the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate from North Dakota. She has been, when I say in the arena, started out from her family hometown of 90 people, right? And went on to become the Attorney General of her state, the North Dakota Tax Commissioner for a little while there, and now runs the Institute for Politics at the University of Chicago. One of the things that jumped out at me from Senator Heitkamp, and it's now I sort of have this connection to 90 that's always going to stay in my head, 90, population of 90, is how important it is to have these conversations depending on where you come from, right, and where you've been. And she launched the One Country Project, an organization aimed at helping Democrats reconnect with rural voters. Again, always working to try to expand the connections that people have. Sitting next to her, Senator Rob Portman, former now senator from Ohio. Senator Portman's public service spanned over 3 decades. He served in the House of Representatives as well as serving in the U.S. Senate. And you've left the judiciary out, but he's got 2 of the 3 branches, served in the executive branch in 2 really important positions. One, heading up the George W. Bush administration's Office of Management and Budget, and then serving as the United States Trade Representative for the country. And for those of you that don't know much about Senator Portman, he, I think, is one of those rare politicians who put outcome, and thus the name of the center, the Center for Policy Solutions, ahead of most everything else. Over 220 bills that were signed into law by Presidents Biden, Trump, and Obama. Right? So a Republican senator, noticed that there were 2 Democratic presidents on that list, right? And that only happened because of folks like Senator Heitkamp, who were willing to see the solution as the main objective and cross the aisle. And so without further ado.
So why would 2 former United States senators actually care about students? I mean, seriously. I mean, we kind of have been around the block. We're a little tired, a little older. And the point is that when you think about the future of our democracy and the future of our country and the position in the world, it's in this room. Because way too often we look for the other person to solve our problems. Who's going to do it? Who's going to be that person who rides in on a white horse, inspires us all, and changes the outcome? That person does not exist in American politics today. And so how do we replace that single idyllic kind of leader, the George Washington of our time, let's say? We replace him the way we always have in the United States of America, with we the people. And we believe, or at least I believe, that the cynicism that has been built up around our democracy and our government has to basically dissipate to be successful going into the future. And if we are not successful in convincing people to be optimistic, to be joyful, to be grateful, number one, that we live in this country, the greatest country ever conceived across the world. Think about it. Certainly the greatest democracy. If we can't be proud of that, and if we can't acknowledge that, then what are we fighting for? We're fighting for a future that is, in my opinion, more economically equal, a future that doesn't destroy the planet, a future that recognizes each individual for their capability and their quality, a future that is a beacon for the rest of the world. The one thing that I would tell you since leaving the Senate, you know, you have a list of things, and I did a lot of work in agriculture, as you can imagine. Being a senator from North Dakota, 90 people, you can imagine what my town looked like. Yeah, there's a woman there, I know, you grew up in that same place, didn't you? And farming community, you know, we knew when the sun shined and the rain came on time, we were gonna do well. But when you think about where we all come from, and you think about the diversity of America, it is an opportunity to also believe that we have a role in preserving this democracy. And so young people have a unique opportunity to step into the cynicism void, to move ahead with some optimism for what we can be into the future, and to realize that if you are not grateful and optimistic about this country, then why would you fight for it? If you didn't appreciate what we had. And so, well, I went to the University of Chicago, in some ways not all willingly, got talked into taking this job, but the one point that I would say has enriched me is every day having contact with the future of this country. Every day having the ability to see the future through your eyes and maybe inspire all of you to be that most important element in our democracy, and that is the label citizen.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah. So first of all, I really enjoyed that introduction because Senator Heitkamp sort of broadened the discussion well beyond just civility, and it's about the future of our country and the role you're going to play in it. So I thank the board members for being here. I thank the fellows for being here. I thank some of the distinguished members of our community for being here. I see a number of you, but really thank the students for coming. And it's not even a free lunch, and here you are. Yeah, back a couple years ago when I decided not to run for re-election, I had to find a place where my papers would be, you know, your notes and your memos and so on. And there were a few schools in Ohio who had talked to me about it, and I thought, you know, I'd really like it to be here at home in Cincinnati. And University of Cincinnati kindly agreed to take those papers. And then I thought, you know, we need to do something with those papers and use them as case studies for something. And I thought after 30 years of public service in and out of actually 3 different administrations and 12 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, unfortunately, my takeaway was that our biggest problem is the increasing inability to solve problems. Therefore, it's the Center for Policy Solutions, not just the Center for Civility or the Center for Bipartisanship or the Center for Finding Common Ground, but that really is what it's about, right? Is that how do you inculcate in future members of the House and the Senate and local government and state government this sense that you're asked by your constituents to get things done for them. And how do we get back to that? And this is why I agree with Senator Heitkamp. It is so important that students are here and listening to this message. You may disagree with me on the message, but at least you'll have to hear it and think about it, which is how do we get back to a situation where you're holding up people who you elect or you yourself are getting into office and in public service who are actually committed to finding solutions. Let me give you a very specific example because it's probably one you've been hearing about, which is the immigration debate. We haven't changed immigration laws in a substantial way since the 1980s. It's a long time. And remember, in the meantime, there have been various proposals, but all of them have been unsuccessful politically or dead on arrival. as the current Speaker of the House said with regard to the Senate proposal that's currently being discussed. And why is that? Well, the American people, I think, for the most part, agree with what we've got to do with regard to immigration. They want a more secure border. They want to deal with people who are here. They want to ensure that, you know, we have legal immigration and it's orderly, and that people from a humanitarian basis are not being abused by these traffickers, right? People can generally agree with that. And yet politically, it's been impossible to find that common ground. And I think in a sense, the American people, and those of you in this room, are kind of well ahead of where elected officials are. I think there's sort of a dichotomy as it's become more polarized in Washington or in Columbus or even here in Cincinnati and city council, wherever. The people more and more are looking for finding common ground and getting things done. And the polling actually supports that. Not that our country isn't polarized, it is. And you know that because you have friends and neighbors, I assume you talk to, who don't agree with you, and you don't agree with them, and you wonder, are they listening? And you might even think, should I be listening? But as a general matter, people want to get things done. They want to elect people who are going to actually accomplish things, whether it's immigration reform, which affects all of us. As the fentanyl floods into Ohio and more people overdose and die, you realize, you know, a border that is porous doesn't make sense for us here in Ohio. And so that's what this is supposed to be about, this center. It's a big task. You know, how do you take this huge issue and try to address it? But we're looking at it in a number of different ways. We've really just gotten started. We have our fellows in place now. Again, a number of them are here. We have 13 of them, and they are fantastic. And we've got a great director in Professor Andy Lewis. If you haven't been in one of Professor Lewis's classes, you apparently have missed out because he's one of the most popular teachers here at University of Cincinnati, based on surveys, based on good public policy surveys that he wrote. No. But he's awesome. And Richard Harknett, who you heard from earlier, he's chair of the Department of SPIA, which is a fancy name for political science, School of Public and International Affairs. But he has embraced this mission also. And so we're housed within SPIA, but we also are working with all the different departments and agencies. You know, I see the dean of the business school was here, the dean of the law school was here earlier. I see people from probably a lot of different majors who are not in SPIA, and that's good. We want to encourage everybody to get involved and engaged in this topic. And it starts with, to me, respect for other points of view. Yes, civility, because civility is part of being able to work together, right? Bipartisanship, that's necessary. By definition, you can't get things done in most bodies, including U.S. Congress, unless it's bipartisan. You have to get 60 votes in the Senate, as an example, supermajority, and we have divided government now. We are likely to have it for a while because the margins are so tight. And it's about, again, this objective, and I think Senator Heitkamp said it well, to have an objective of achieving a result, not an objective of just throwing out the red meat on the left or on the right and raising money and getting reelected, but actually doing something. And I think as citizens, our task, all of us, is to hold those people up who are focused on results, even if you don't agree with them on everything. And by the same token, not holding up those who are interested in partisan politics, because if we don't, our republic is in danger. I really believe that. Because ultimately, as free people, self-governing people, you know, we've got to figure out how to achieve results. The debt and deficit, the healthcare costs, the housing crisis, certainly immigration and the borders we talked about. It just goes on and on, doesn't it? Where there seems to be this sort of inability to find that common ground and come together. So that's what this is about. I don't know how much we'll get into the specifics today, but I hope you'll think of some questions that challenge us a little bit as to, you know, whether this makes sense, whether there is a possibility here. Senator Heitkamp and I got to serve together. It was my privilege to get to serve with her because she was a can-do North Dakotan who wanted to get things done. And so we did a number of bills together, including one called the Regulatory Accountability Act, which she took a lot of heat for. I took less heat for it. Some Republicans thought it didn't go far enough. Most Democrats thought it went way too far. And it was pretty simple. How do you do cost-benefit analysis, for instance, on regulations so they make more sense? But I got to watch her in action there and watch her, again, take more heat, more slings and arrows from her side, and yet she hung in there because she knew it was the right thing to do. We also worked on a bill together where maybe I took a little more heat on my side. which had to do with taking on the tech companies with regard to trafficking, human trafficking. And we were able together, for the first time ever, and by the way, it hasn't happened since either, to actually get rid of what's called Section 230, which you may have heard about, which provides an immunity to tech platforms to be able to provide information. They're not liable. So they were not liable when they were providing a platform for sex traffickers to sell underage girls online, as an example. And we were able to pass legislation to address that issue. There was one website called Backpage that about 70% of the sex trafficking was going on. We were successful in shutting that down. And so it was something that was a delivery for the people of North Dakota, the people of Ohio. In both states we had and still do have serious issues in this regard. But that's an example of where you develop a trust with somebody and you can work together and stick together and actually get something done for the good of the country, the good of the people you represent. So I look forward to the conversation on this broader topic, and really any specifics that you want to get into, we're happy to discuss. So thank you for being here. Thanks, Andy.
I'm going to borrow this microphone. That was excellent. Thank you both. I'm going to lead with a couple questions, and we'll open it up to everyone. But I want to start with this: what principles guide you when it comes to finding common ground and promoting civility? So what are your principles? How do you think about that? And where did you learn them from? You know, like, how did they originate in you? How did they cultivate inside of you, or in your public life?
My motivation is a good idea. And when I first got to the Senate, I had this really good idea, and I went to a senior member in the Democratic caucus. I said, I have this really great idea. Now I don't even remember what it was. But I always fall in love with my ideas. And that's a lesson for all of you. Fall in love with your ideas. And he said, oh, that is a good idea, but it'll never happen. And I said, that's the difference between the United States Senate and the real world. In the real world, if you have a good idea and a lot of passion for that idea, you can move it forward. And so I think you've got to start with a good idea. And then there has to be an opportunity, I think, to see what can be accomplished as a result of that good idea. And that's the moral element. There are a lot of good ideas, and some people may think autocracy is a good idea. I mean, you know, China can build their economy and not have anybody get in the way. Do we want an economy like China, built on autocracy, built on central control? It's a nice shortcut. Let me tell you, if the right guy's in charge or the right woman's in charge, could work, right? But is that who we want to be? And so a good idea coupled with a level of moral enthusiasm. And so, you know, and a little dash of arrogance. Why do I say that? Because I think if I have a good idea that's morally just, I can convince anyone it's a good idea that is morally just. And I think, you know, I think that's where the personality comes in. That's where the stories come in. You know, but I would have to say that in my motivation really comes from maybe a sense of a good idea, kind of an intellectual product that I think is creative, is capable, and will change things for the better. And then once you have that, then you have the enthusiasm to go forward.
Yeah, Andy, just quickly, I think in every one of your families, and for those of you who are working in your business life and in your social life here on campus, you have to make concessions, right? Like, you don't always get your way. And so, to me, politics is almost the opposite of real life. Like, you know, if you say my way or the highway, and you can be successful in that because you can raise money, because you can get reelected, the way our primary system works, because you can get plaudits from a, you know, maybe a minority of of Americans, but an intense minority who believe in you, that is what's being rewarded today too often. And you know some of these people I'm talking about. So just one quick example of that. There were, I think, 8 members of Congress who dethroned Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House. Remember that, when there was no Speaker of the House for like a month? And it had never been done in the history of the United States. It was pretty amazing. And so these 8 individuals, most of whom were not household names. Some were, a couple were. But they got on Meet the Press that next week. They raised millions of dollars online. They were held up by a vocal but distinct minority in our party, the Republican Party, and they were rewarded, right? I mean, they all came from red districts, so they didn't have a district that created political problems probably, but I remember both on Meet the Press, but also on all the other shows, Face the Nation, This Week, if you ever watch these news shows, they all had these Republicans on who had never been on these shows before probably, thinking, this is a pretty good deal. They represented, by the way, 3.9% of the Republican caucus. 3.9%, but they got all the play. So I just think that's a different reality than the reality that you live in and the rest of us live in, where my motivation comes from just growing up in a family where we had to, I had a brother and a sister who liked things differently than I did sometimes. You had to work it out. Sometimes, we fought a little bit, but you worked it out, right? Some of you come from even bigger families where it's even harder. And then in my business life, you have to come up with a solution ultimately. And in your life here on campus, you can't always get your way. So that's, to me, what is extraordinary or really kind of out of the mainstream is the way that politics works. That you get rewarded for holding on to your belief, whatever it is, and your point of view. And for some members of the House and Senate, maybe it's not even a strongly held belief, but it works. So, and again, I point to the immigration debate right now. I think it's going to be tough to get this bill across the Senate floor, in part because of that people aren't willing to work as a team to try to figure out a solution. And because the politics works pretty well, for both sides, by the way, to keep this as a hot issue out there rather than an issue that gets resolved.
Following up, have you ever made a mistake, an incivility? Have you ever been uncivil towards someone in your and what did you learn from it?
Yes.
Are you willing to fess up to it? I mean, you're retired now. Have you ever made an incivil mistake, and what did you learn from it?
I'm sure I've made many. I remember once I was on the floor of the Senate, and one of my colleagues, who will remain unnamed, but his initials were John McCain, and we were very good friends. I played the role of Barack Obama in his debate preparation, so he didn't like me very much, but said I got under his skin. But seriously, he disagreed with me strongly on something, and you remember John. He didn't hold back, and he was a sailor, meaning that he could throw an F-bomb. Let's just say that. And we got into it on the floor of the Senate. He was unlike me. He was the kind of guy who could do that, and then the next day everything was great, But I kind of let that fester and probably did not treat him very well for a while. But that's one example I can think of. But in the end, I have colleagues who get very disappointed in another member, often on the other side of the aisle. And I will say, honestly, with regard to Senator Heitkamp, we did a lot of things together. We did other legislation on helping people get mortgages, as an example. It was her idea. And, she held tough, I held tough. And
You had a lot of grief on that one.
You got grief on that one, but you held tough. And so we didn't have this experience. But with other colleagues, frankly, I've been disappointed. Like on the infrastructure bill, I spent about a year of my life devoted to trying to get this bill done so we could have a new Brent Spence Bridge and other things. And some members who I worked with really hard voted no, at the end of the day. And it seemed to be more political than substantive. Now, that's my point of view, okay? But you're disappointed, right? And maybe even a little ticked off. And there was another one I was involved very much in this Respect for Marriage Act discussion. And there were some very emotional and tough discussions there. And I was very disappointed in some colleagues. But I kept reminding myself of what I would tell other colleagues, which is, don't ever burn a bridge. Because eventually that person is someone you will need to work with on something else. And this goes to your life generally. you know, you may be disappointed with somebody, you should be honest, they should be honest with you, but keep that flicker alive, you know, of friendship, and at some point, you may come back and that person may be, you know, very useful to you in some way or helpful to you, or just become a friend again. In the sense of the House and Senate, that person could be necessary for you to get your next bill done. And that's a hard lesson that I learned.
Yeah, I think we all can look back and say, could we have done things better? Could we have been more communicative? Could we have explained our position better? Sure. But the one thing that I would say, and, you know, I've since tried to apologize. Al Franken, a pretty prominent senator from Minnesota, ended up in this series of allegations about inappropriate behavior that had already been referred to Senate ethics. And there was yet another claim that went to Senate ethics, and I was part of the din, the noise saying he had to resign. And at the time that I did it, I knew I shouldn't do it. At the time I did it, I knew it wasn't fair to Al. But I did it anyway because you got swept up in this idea that now you had to be the righteous one. You had to point the finger. You couldn't, you know, just let the process carry out. And so I regret that. I regret jumping to conclusions or taking a shortcut at the expense of a friend. And, you know, I've since apologized to Al. We have great conversations, but it's a lesson that I want all of you to know, because there will be times in your life when you'll be asked to join the group, condemn something, and you will in your gut know that it's wrong. Don't take the shortcut. Don't take the shortcut. In the end, you'll look back and you aren't judging Al Franken anymore, you're judging yourself. And so that would be an example.
Thank you both for sharing. Speaking of friendship, you read surveys and stories and you hear about sort of the decline of friendship and the appreciation for people. In political science, we call this effective polarization, where you don't want your kids to marry people of the other party. You think they're evil, a whole host of things. And a lot of this comes from members of Congress and the way we see this reported. But what does bipartisan friendship look like? And what has it looked like in the United States Congress? Can you give us a different picture than maybe sometimes we see? Is there bipartisan friendship? Maybe we should start there.
Yeah, look, I think one of the lessons I hope that we learned, and we can help impart to you guys today, is that it's not as bad as it seems. I painted a pretty negative picture earlier about the inability to find common ground, and that's true. But in terms of friendships and relationships, it's not as bad as it seems, in the sense that people get along generally, not everybody. Some people literally won't talk to a member of the other party. I mean, some of my colleagues, some of the newer colleagues, and I think some of yours, the same thing. But I do think that's one misunderstanding, is that, you know, you can have a friendship. Now, it's not as easy as it used to be, in my view. I was at this, 12 years in the House and then 12 years in the Senate, administration in between. I saw a change in that. I saw it almost became extraordinary, unusual to have a friendship with a member of the other party. But it still happens. One thing people say, and I guess there's some truth to this, but there's a balance, is that in the old days, members of Congress lived in Washington, they had their families there, their kids knew the other person's kids, they went to school together perhaps, they'd have a Friday night barbecue together, whatever. Now, for the most part, all the members go back to the district or the state, usually on Thursday night, and that's what I did. We kept our family here the whole time. We never moved from Cincinnati. We wanted to raise our kids here. I think that was the right decision for us. But it meant that I was in Washington very little, unless I had to be there for votes. And so our kids didn't meet their kids and so on. So today, Senator Heitkamp met my son, Jed, who couldn't stay because he was working, so he had to take off after lunch. But, it's an example. Like, you probably never met Jed before. So I think that is one of the differences. But on the other hand, people are closer to their constituents if they're going home, right? So it's a balance. But in the old days, members knew each other personally much better than they do now.
At least when we were there, people liked each other. They may not have voted together, but they liked each other. One of my best friends, a guy named Bob Corker, senator from Tennessee. I love Bob. Still love Bob. We had lots of, did we vote alike? No, we didn't vote alike. But I trusted Bob. If Bob said something to me, I think what's more important than liking each other is trusting each other. And I think that's what's lost in Washington. That this idea that you can approach someone and say, okay, can you keep an open mind on this? They go back, they talk to staff, they evaluate it politically, and it's off the table. Nothing was ever off the table with me. In part because I'm a Democrat in a conservative state. But, Rob has told you all the ways my party wasn't happy with me, but many of the things that I advanced, whether it was opening up oil exports, kind of globally, whether it was doing some work on carbon capture as a strategy for climate, these were things that were not hard in North Dakota. It wasn't hard to be for regulatory reform in North Dakota. It was hard in Washington, but it wasn't hard in North Dakota. And so, when people don't trust each other, institutions fall apart. Because one thing that we've learned the last 6 years is that so much of what is essential in our body politic is a norm. It's not a rule, it's not a law, it's a norm. There's no law that says that you have to concede an election. That's a norm. It's a norm that was broken. There's no law that says that you have to, be civil. Those were norms. Those are norms that are being broken. And they're broken because we no longer trust each other, because we think less of each other in Washington. And so when I look at people, I see an erosion of trust even out in America. People not trusting each other anymore. I don't know, but social scientists sometimes equate that to the growth of social media, where people can be anonymous in what they say, creating a huge level of, kind of paranoia. But I think more than likability, trust has been what's breached, and that needs to get back. We need to get back to where we can trust each other to do the right thing and trust the motivation of each other. And that's true not just in Washington, but across the board.
That's a really good point. And you've probably seen some of the polling on trust in institutions. By the way, the universities. So it's all of us, right? But certainly Congress. It's like below used car salesmen and exterminators now. There's just a lack of trust in our basic institutions. And again, so it's really, we're self-governing, right? So if you don't have trust in your government, I think the republic's in danger. I think representative democracy requires a certain amount of trust in the judicial system and the legislative branch and the executive branch. And I think you've hit on something big there in terms of trust. I think, and maybe this is just because I'm too focused on the policy side of getting things done, but I think it's because people aren't seeing accomplishments that help them. Why would you trust Congress if you are told every day the immigration system is at crisis levels? It's a catastrophe on the border, and it is, and yet nothing's getting done. I think that's how you start to rebuild trust, is you actually pass legislation that affects people and affects their daily lives. I would think the infrastructure bill is an opposite example of that. Most people kind of so-so about it probably, but some people really get it, that it helps them on their commute. It helps them to get their kid to school and also get to work. It helps them to be able, to have a better life. And that builds trust. So I think part of our discussion here, this broader discussion, how do you get back to where there is an incentive to find common ground rather than incentive to be out there and get all the rewards of that? There should be more reward for this, for finding that common ground, and then I think trust will begin to follow.
So we have a bunch of divides in the country, and one of the ways we're divided is really region, urban, rural. And Senator Heitkamp, I know you've had a lot of initiative on trying to bridge the urban-rural divide and thinking about ways forward. One, why is that important to you? And two, what are some strategies that might help when we think about this way? I know, Senator Portman, you also give some thought to this, but I'd love to hear Senator Heitkamp take the lead on that.
So if you think about my situation, okay, so I'm a, by all counts, moderate to conservative Democrat representing a very red state. To give you an idea of how red, North Dakota gave Donald Trump the third highest percentage of any state. So it was West Virginia, Wyoming, and North Dakota. So just understand that. When I ran in 2012, I knew that 22% of the people who voted for Mitt Romney had to vote for me in order to be successful, because Barack Obama was going to lose North Dakota by at least 22 points. So we did what we do. You know, we talked about the issues. We talked about, you know, what kind of leader I was going to be. And I was able to convince 23% of those people to cross over. And that's how I ended up being the unicorn in the Senate. No one thought I could win. But those people were willing to cross over. When I ran for re-election, it was only 4%. 4% of those people who voted for Donald Trump would cross over and vote for me. Why is that? It's because we have regionalized our politics. Now, some people might say we're voting with our feet, that people who used to vote Democratic have moved out of North Dakota. That's not true. That's not true if you look at demographic information. Somehow we have failed to communicate a unifying American message in this country. When I started my project, a lot of people thought it should be called the Rural Project or this or that. I said, no, it's going to be called One Country. Because what we're trying to do is unite the country, not explain why rural America is the best place to grow up in the world. She doesn't think so. Or explain, I'm just picking on you, because you have red hair, so got to do it. Anyway, you know, I did this because we spend so much time dividing each other. And my experience is that fundamentally, 90%, 80 to 90% of what we want for our country is common, whether you're a cab driver in New York or a business person in Carrington, North Dakota. So why are we so divided? We're divided out of fear of each other. Fear of the other is what's been divided us, and to some extent, fear of change, and a sense of disrespect. Now, one thing I will tell you is I don't buy the, oh, we're from rural America, we're so disrespected, you think we're Hicks from the sticks, blah, blah, blah. And there's people who do. I'm not saying there aren't. But how many times have you heard someone from rural America say, we're the real America? This is where the real people live. Well, I don't know what a real person is, because it seems to me people live all over this country. And so I frequently ask people when they say that, why do you think you're better than the cab driver in New York? Why are you better than the guy working to repair LaGuardia Airport in New York City? We have lost our sense of common purpose. And so, to me, this regional divide is symptomatic of losing our sense of what it is to be an American. And until we define that in a way that everybody sees themselves in that unifying message, we're headed for problems. We're headed for further divisions. And so, for me, the urban-rural divide is real. It is a sense that we can't communicate with each other. We don't trust each other. That somehow either side is less than we are. And if we don't bridge that gap, and it's like a racial gap, a racial gap, a gender gap, an age gap, if we don't begin to bridge these gaps in this country, it will unravel our democracy. And so I'm uniquely qualified to talk about rural America. Grew up in a town of 90 people. My family was 1/10 the population. And I had to negotiate with more brothers and sisters than you did. My mother had 7 kids. In 9 years, when I was born, my mother had 4 kids, and the oldest was 2. And there were no twins. And yes, you can do that. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, so I grew up in a place where people had to learn to get along because that was about survival. And I want to bring that ethic back to this country. I want to bring that ethic back to our fraying social fabric. And so this is a passion for me, and I think it does not begin in Washington, D.C. It does not begin with George Washington riding through here with a white horse. We're always good in this country when the threat is external. There is nothing that unites this country more than an external threat. Don't believe me? September 11th. Point to any time and look at the polling, any time we have been highly motivated as a country come together, it's been against an external threat. And now the threats are internal. And we have a different dynamic, and we have to deploy a different set of strategies to solve that problem. And to me, that the strategy that we're deploying is a greater understanding regionally about who we are as Americans.
No, that's great. I'm going to try to put this back in the same construct, and maybe I'm pushing it here, but I really think polarization has a lot of different elements, and I think social media does actually contribute to it because people go online and find something that affirms their views, right, and stick to it. And there's no one source, there's no ABC, CBS, NBC telling us, you know, kind of what it is. Not that they were perfect, but usually more down the middle. But I do think that the way people view politics affects it. And I say this because, remember we talked about how you get some advantages from being on the peripheral. Fundraising. Online fundraising is now the big thing. Most money gets raised online. If you want to be successful in online fundraising, what do? You throw out the red meat. You beat up the other side really bad. And that's how you do it. You don't talk about policy and, you know, how do you come to common ground. That doesn't tend to motivate that minority of voters, but that intense minority of voters who are going to give you $50 and $30 and $20 and $70 again and again. So in the Senate race coming up in Ohio this year, most of the money will be coming actually from online small donors. And you might say that's great, small donors, great, but it pushes the candidate further to the left or further to the right to raise money that way. And so campaigns are being structured more that way, and that helps to, I think, exaggerate this divide that might be out there anyway. And then second, just how campaigns focus. They're focused the same way. You know, it's not so much about building your coalition now, it is about getting out your vote. And if you look at campaigns at every level, really, most of the consultants will tell you that. Some of you may have been involved in some of those campaigns. Like, how do you get your vote out? How do you get young people to vote? Not how do you broaden the base to get everybody out there to vote, and how do you reach out to independents, or how do you get conservative Democrats if you're Republican, or moderate Republicans if you're a Democrat? It's a different sort of approach. And I saw that change over, you know, 6 presidential campaigns that I've been involved with as a surrogate, where they're now much more targeted on, you know, sending red meat out to their folks on the right and the left. So I do think there's a connection here between all this. I'm not saying there wouldn't be polarization anyway, given social media and given other societal factors that are difficult to address, but I think there is a level of complicity, I guess, with the way the political system works that's leading to more division. And I couldn't agree with Senator Heitkamp more. When you get right down to it, Ohio's a great state to represent because we have big cities, we have big industry, we have big ag, we have a lot of small farms and small communities, and we have Appalachian Ohio, we have, you know, Northwest Ohio where they actually root for Michigan, and we have everything, you know. And so you get around and meet people, and there's some universals. You know, people really are looking for the same thing generally in life, right? And they care about their families, they care about their community, they care about their economics, the prosperity of their families and their kids, and share a lot of the same American values that stick us, you know, in a unique place in the world history. We are that beacon of hope and opportunity for the rest of the world because we are the biggest and oldest democracy, and we've managed to figure out, you know, how to become this super achieving nation. And I think it's still there, but it has to be brought out and not discouraged through the political process.
So I know that some of you may have to get to another class. If that's the case, now's a good time. But if you can stay, we're going to have 20 minutes of audience Q&A, and then maybe we may uncover some great things. But if you have to go to your next class, now's a good time. Dr. Harknett and I are we're going to rove the audience for some questions, and we would love to have you engage with us.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Absolutely.
You can use this.
Great. All right. So somebody's got to be brave. Boy, look at that. I got to go there,
Give me a
right?
hard time now.
Yeah, it's fun actually.
I have to go right here. And if you could, just quick introduction of your name and maybe your major. And go ahead.
Good afternoon, Senators. I'm Ambria. I am a double major in international affairs and political science. And I have a question based on what your opening statement was. You want us to have more optimism towards the future. I just want to know where we need to get that from. We are currently in an age where there's rhetoric going around about us having to retire at the age of 70, disenfranchising young voters, not doing what many voters are asking our senators and our House representatives doing when we're calling, we're voting. We're just simply not being represented. What do you suggest that we do to have more optimism in this time when we're not being listened to?
When you vote, you're listened to. So let's just take Michigan, okay? Michigan had record, and Wisconsin had record youth turnout. Now you can agree or disagree with the decisions they made in Wisconsin on a justice of the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, which totally changed redistricting, totally changed Wisconsin's position on choice. You can disagree with what happened in Michigan where they ended up with a majority, but I can show you in both of those cases that youth vote is the reason why that happened. And we used to say this in politics when I'd say, how are you going to win? They'd say, well, I'm going to turn out young people. I'd laugh. I'd say, you know what we call people who say that's their strategy? Losers. They're not going to win because youth won't turn out. But one thing that I will tell you is I have proof positive that when youth vote, it changes outcomes. And so, yeah, you know, my trajectory is a lot longer. I've been at this. I ran my first statewide race when I was 28 years old. And so by the time I lost my Senate race, I think that might have been my 8th statewide race. So I've been at this a long time, and I've been up and I've been down. I've lost races, I've won races. And I've never been discouraged about this country. And so you're gonna win and you're gonna lose and it's gonna look bleak, but when you organize and you get out there and you do the work and you see the result, whatever that may look like for you, you see the result, you can sit back and say, I did that. Then comes the accountability. And I think this is what Rob was getting at, the cynicism that people feel because they were promised something that didn't get delivered. That they thought that that would be the one thing that would change the outcome. Guess what? One election doesn't change outcomes in this country. You have to stay at it. And so I can give you lots of reasons to be optimistic about when youth vote. Why do you think people are so afraid of Taylor Swift? Honest to God, who is she, right? I mean, I don't even know her music, but I am amazed at the number of people who are terrified by her because she is motivating people to register to vote. And they think those people will not vote the way they want them to vote, right? And so what does that tell you about your power? It tells you got lots of power if you exercise it. Young people are the least performing, even in those states, the least performing category. And so when the highest performing category of voters is over the age of 65, what do you think the priorities are going to be of politicians who represent them? It's going to be 65-year-old priorities, right? You dance with those who got you there. And so I'm saying organize, organize. And I know on this campus, I shouldn't say I know on this campus, but on the University of Chicago campus, we have a project out of the IOP called You Shy Votes. And there's a number of youth voting movements. We're going to be doing a exercise at the end of August, bringing in youth coordinators who are organizing youth vote efforts on college campuses. I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican. Youth need to vote, because if we don't get you in the habit of voting now, we may lose you as voters forever. And right now, as Senator Portman said, what, 8% or 20% of the voters are electing our Congress. So think of how powerful you are. So I'd say be optimistic, because they're afraid of you.
I can't help but make one quick comment, and that has to do with an issue, and that is the debt, the deficit, the fiscal insanity that's going on right now in this country, which is taxes that you will be paying, thank you very much, long after I'm gone. And if young people don't vote, that issue doesn't get addressed, I'm afraid. So you talked about, not wanting to retire at a later age. With all due respect, I think you should be more concerned about that if you are relying on seniors to give you your advice, that you're going to get left holding the bag, and that our economy will suffer, you will suffer, your families will suffer. And it really is getting to the point where, people are looking at our economy and thinking, oh my gosh, can this hold together when you have a $34 trillion debt, and when you have, as a percent of our economy, the highest debt we've had ever in our country? So I think this is one where young voters in particular ought to get engaged and involved. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, think of what the two candidates have said so far. I say the two candidates. Nikki Haley is still in the race, but Joe Biden and Donald Trump, as opposed to Nikki Haley, by the way, have said, we're not going to touch Social Security. We're not going to touch Medicare. We're not going to touch Medicaid. We're not going to touch these issues that, if you don't touch them, by the way, those programs themselves are in danger of not being there when you need them. I mean, in 10 short years, Social Security will be able to pay 24% less in benefits under current law. And the default in Congress is not to do anything, right? So I think it's going to happen because youth vote is not being heard. So I would hope, I know there's lots of other issues, and there's the environment, there's social issues and other things, but this is one where I really feel like if young people were voting for both parties in higher numbers. By the way, a poll yesterday, NBC poll, you may have seen it, for voters 18 to 34 years old, it's 50-50, Biden-Trump. So it's not, people say, well, they're all going to vote for Democrats. No, young people are smart. They have different views on different things, and they're not just monolithic. But on this issue of what our economic future is, our fiscal house, getting that in order, I hope is one that, you will encourage your friends and classmates and colleagues to vote on.
Yeah, I just want to add, I have a friend, Byron Dorgan, who says we will be the first generation, baby boomers, who inherited from our parents and borrowed from our kids. It will be the largest intergenerational transfer of responsibility in the history of our country. But more importantly, it also will be the largest
Anyway, by that I mean, we are moving towards the majority. So who's gonna be that, what's that cohort that's gonna take? It's a huge interracial transfer of responsibility.
Peter, can you project the microphone to the front, and we'll just
I don't know what happened.
audience.
I think it lost battery. Yeah.
Thank you for being here today and spending your time and giving your time to young people, to students. My name is Peter Kovac. I'm an MPA student here at UC. You've shared examples of your civility and others' civility. Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing examples of your incivility. Few as they may be, that vulnerability is also really appreciated. I'm interested if you have an example of seeing someone move from incivility to civility, whether it's something that you did or you saw something happen where there was incivility and then something happened, some maybe something that maybe we could control in our lives as opposed to an external shock, but something that happened that brought civility to a situation where it was lacking.
Okay, I'm gonna start, and Heidi's answer will be much better than mine because she's got to be thoughtful about it. But three quick examples. One is my grandparents and your grandparents. Probably you probably saw them change some of their views over time, including on tough issues like race or same-sex marriage, gay rights. Second would be for me. I don't know if this is civility or incivility, depending on how you look at it, but just changing my views on some issues over time by listening to others and including my own family. And I think it's possible. I mean, people could change. And so when my colleagues are, railing against the other side, and again, to me, it's not just about that. That's almost, as Paul Ryan says, you misrealize this Paul Ryan's quote, performance art, railing against the other side, not maybe because they really believe it, but because that benefits them within their own primary, within their own fundraising, within their own social media network, within their own political advantage. When I see that, I think, gosh, this incivility seems to be working for them. So how do you change that? And I can't tell you I've been very successful in convincing them, hey, if you want to become a statesman someday, and someone who people respect on both sides of the aisle, you might try this approach. And that's not, it's, they have to feel it from the people who would support them, like everybody in this room. So it's a tall order.